Hey guys, it's Reed Young for transformpoker.com. Today we are checking out a 6-max no limit hand where we're playing 2-4 no limit. So we got some middle stakes action for you guys this time around. And the typical buy-in for this game is $400. So let's hop into the action. I guess before we get started going through what leads up to our turn decision, as you guys are probably checking out what's going on in this hand history right now. I just wanted to mention real quick that talking about all the decisions that lead up to our ultimate decision, which is the turn bet or check here in this hand, is really what makes or breaks the correct decision in almost every spot in poker, especially the more marginal ones, which happen to be the most interesting ones. So when I go through hands bit by bit, just know it's definitely made up of little important bits to make your game better, and that also it's extremely important for the ultimate decision. So let's check out the rest of the action here. We decide to min raise the button, which a lot of people are liking these days for several reasons. A nice thing about it is that you get to call a lot of re-raises in position and play it with a nice pot to stack ratio, which we actually just blogged about. So I'll go ahead and put that in the description if you guys want to check out a cool article on pot to stack ratio that might kind of illuminate a little bit of the thought process going on pre-flop here. So we min raise the big blind re-raises after the small blind's folded. It's a bit large of a re-raise, but I think it's fine. It's not like anything that's really like glaring as a huge mistake, but I think in general, just because he's only winning $12, or really I guess $14, that risking $28 more to do that, he doesn't really have to, and you can get away with having about the same folding equity with risking fewer dollars pre-flop. So if you can make it 28 and we fold just as often, then why not do that? And you can bluff a bit more often since you're not risking as much to win the same amount. So pretty cool stuff there, but he goes ahead and makes it 32. Not much to worry about. We have 9-8 suited, and we're in position. We have some great post-flop possibilities. We're very unlikely to be dominated. So if he is re-raising a less polarized range, meaning if he's re-raising hands just beyond pocket tens and better, and like ace queen suited and better, then it's none of those really include a 9. So he's not going to have stuff like ace 9 or king 9 very often. So that makes our call a little bit more attractive. So we call pre-flop and we flop top pair. Kind of one of the issues for this hand is that even top pair a lot of the time isn't that great, but because it's suited and connected, I think a lot more of the important factors for the hand are the ability to flop a draw that you can then call a flop bet and then maybe shove over a turn bet or call another bet. There's a lot of possibilities, but I wouldn't get too wrapped up in the actual value of the pair. It's definitely something secondary and a smaller piece of the overall value of this type of hand when you're talking about comparing hands 100 big blinds effective. So if we compare this hand to something like king queen, where we're much happier just to flop a pair and then go with it, you're more looking to flop a connected board like this one, where it looks fairly connected with a straight draw or a flush draw. So when the big blind checks and we decide to bet, first off, I think the bet is maybe a bit large, not a huge deal. But I think betting is okay, because unless the big blind makes a huge check raise here, like he check raises all in for instance, then we're pretty happy to call the check raise, because there's just so many turns that we're happy to call a shove on. Really any spade, 8, 9, maybe even a 6, depending on how loose our opponent is, check raising and then shoving the turn. So a lot of good cards to continue on. So we bet 40. I guess another thing I want to touch on is betting larger actually makes it a bit more attractive for our opponent to check raise all in. So a nice thing about betting small, in addition to, like we were talking about before with the pre-flop raise sizing, not risking more than you have to take down a pot, and it allows us to bluff more often. If we bet smaller, then it's less likely we get check raise all in. Because if our opponent check raises all in, he's risking a ton of money to win, less than he would be had we bet something 40 or a bit larger. So he makes it 98. We're getting fantastic odds to call, and like I said, there's a ton of cards that improve us on the turn. So no-brainer call, I think, on the flop. And on the turn, this is where we have our main decision. Big blind checks to us, and we have a close decision with about a pot size bet left. So I think most of the time we're thinking all in or fold here. Really, the only reason to bet smaller would be to induce a check raise from something like Queen 10, but I think for most players they're just going to be shoving that on this turn anyway. So when you do induce a check raise, a lot of the time it's just from a better hand that probably would have called your all in anyway. So it doesn't really do much other than give your opponent better pot odds if he does have something slightly better that he could end up folding to a shove like Jack 10. So another thing I guess to consider when we're talking about betting or checking on the turn is that with 9-8 suited, if we're called, we are very unlikely to have the best hand. So that's kind of thing number one. And I think a lot of people maybe watching this video might get a little too wrapped up in that. Just because we don't have the best hand when we're called doesn't mean that we should not bet, and here's why. So if you think about our range overall to bet call this flop, what hands do we have? So maybe we don't even play 5-6 suited this way pre-flop. It's a bit weak of a hand to call a re-raise with, since we're only 100 big blinds effective. And like I was saying, a pair of 5s and 6s, I mean, those are even weaker than 8s and 9s, and it's very unlikely that you're ever going to have top pair with a pair of 5s or 6s, whereas with a hand like 8-9, it does happen some of the time. You also flop straights where your opponents have top pair hands a bit more often, so your implied odds are a bit higher for several reasons with a hand like 9-8 as opposed to 5-6, so that's why you might end up folding 5-6 pre-flop. So if we don't have 5-6, really what air could we have in our range to bet call the flop? Maybe we have 8-7 suited, but if we're saying 8-9 is a close bet on the flop, then why would we be betting 8-7? Doesn't really make much sense. So in reality, maybe we would be bet calling a draw like 10-8, which is now a straight, Jack 10 of hearts, which now has a jack, and a few other straight draws, most of which have a jack or a now are pretty strong on the turn. So when we bet call, this is actually one of the weakest hands now in our range. And even though we do have a lot of equity, I think the best play on the turn here is to go all in, because our equity when called is pretty high. If we check back and our opponent bets the river, we might make a mistake by folding if we haven't improved on the river. So if we don't have a straight or a two pair or a flush by the river, then it might be tough to call a bet from an opponent who can pretty easily represent a hand like Jack 10 or pocket queens. So something else also to consider is if he is just going ahead and check calling us with a hand like pocket queens here, you might not want to bet. And this is, I guess, getting away from kind of like the default best play, what we would call something closer to game theory optimal. So game theory optimal just means that if there is absolutely no information about either player and we had to make a strategy solely based on the dynamics of the game, what would we do to have the best possible average outcome? That's a pretty decent and simple way to look at it. However, in most poker games, you're going to have a lot more information than that. So if we know this guy is a little bit weaker of a player and he's not going to be able to go through all the thought process that we've already covered, and realize that if we do shove this turn on a jack, that our range is a lot of the time stronger than just even Jack 10, because him check raising the flop and then checking to us on the turn certainly represents more of a range like air or queens or better, maybe a turn jack with something random, and less of a hand like 9x. Value betting a jack in that situation doesn't really make any sense. So when we do bet, our range appears extremely strong, if we have no air in our range, depending if we play 5-6 suited or not pre-flop, and if we bet call middle pair on the flop, if we even do have hands where that we do have a 7 in that often. If you think about it, our turn betting range is incredibly strong, so this should be a credible bluff. However, at 2-4, a lot of people are just going to be thinking like, oh, queens are higher than the jack. So if he might also be trying to put us on a jack, like Jack 10. It might not make sense, but you might actually see people trying to value bet that hand at 2-4. And if that's the case, then there's no way you should be folding queens. So this is a good example of where the game theory optimal play is likely to be less valuable than the exploitive option given information we have about this player. He's tight, he's showdown oriented, he check raised the flop, which tight people don't really do that often as a bluff. All of those things are leaning toward him having actually a fairly strong range on this turn, or just having a hand that's going to give up the rest of the way. If that's the case, we should probably check down, but if he's a better player, shoving the turn is definitely the best play, and I think the optimal play. So that's definitely a lot to take in. If you guys have any questions or comments about it, I know I covered a lot of different stuff there. Hit us up in the comment section below. And if you enjoy the video, consider leaving a like or sharing it with a poker buddy. Alright, take care guys.